Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, Sari, and thank you anyway to the wider CIPS Southern Africa team for arranging these sessions. I think as everyone would have been told, you've been given the opportunity to speak. If you keep yourself muted when you're not speaking, that would be perfect. But from my perspective, the value you will get from this kind of a session is by asking lots of questions, by being interactive, etc. So, hopefully we can have quite an engaging session. If everyone's a bit quiet, I might start singling people out and getting them to contribute as we go through. So please do make sure you get the value you need out from this session to pass your exams. So I am going to be talking to you about CIPS L4M3, which is the commercial contracting module. Just a quick background. My background is quite broad. I started off in engineering and operations. I'm also a chartered accountant, and of course I did my CIPS exams. So I've been through the process which everyone here has to go through. I did this through the last set of syllabus and actually managed to win the President's Award. So when it comes to things like exam technique, I often talk quite a lot about how do you make sure you're prepared, etc. And like Sari said, we operate a lot of study centres. I'm currently actually in the UK. I do travel around a lot, but obviously COVID has restricted that somewhat. But we have quite a large network, and hopefully we can add a bit of value to you this morning. So I've got about just under 3 hours, I think, to talk to you. We will make sure we have a break on the hour, and aside to you jumping in as and when you want to throughout the session, you have the opportunity to have a bit of a Q&A session after each learning outcome. So I'm going to start off by looking at very quickly where does this module fit in, and how does this all work in terms of CIPS level 4. My experience is that to score well in all of these exams, you want to understand the bigger picture. The examiners aren't trying to trick anyone up. It's about making sure you have understanding, you can demonstrate your understanding and application. Then we're going to go by learning outcomes. So we'll spend about 45 minutes looking at learning outcome 1, just to make sure we've all got that foundation, and that's all about the legal issues around the formation of contracts. We'll have a short break, and then we'll move into learning outcome 2, and we're going to talk about specifications, KPIs as well, and how all of these relate to the contractual arrangements with our suppliers. And then finally, learning outcome 3, so key clauses which we should have in our contracts. And we're going to start thinking a bit about some of the sustainability issues as well, so labour standards, etc. Now, for those of you who've not done any of your exams before, you'll have 6 credits and 12 credit modules. And this module is a 6 credit module, which means that it's examined through what we call objective response, which will be things like multiple choice, maybe some drag and drop, or at least select all which apply kind of questions. The reason that I'm going to do this session mostly focused on the learning outcomes. A lot of you would have had access to study guides, you'd have had sessions, you've got the books, etc. But the thing to remember is that the questions you get in your exam are not taken necessarily from the book. So the book is written as a reference against the syllabus, which is the learning outcomes. And similarly, examiners will write all their questions from the learning outcomes only. They won't be looking at any particular book when they're coming up with their questions. So on the basis that hopefully most of you have actually done a bit of work to get up to this stage, we're going to focus mostly on the learning outcomes, and that's what I will try and take you through as a bit of a discussion. So the structure, like I said, we'll do a bit of an overview, then we'll go into each learning outcomes. Just make a quick note of when we're going to have our breaks, sort of on the hour, and especially make sure that you are contributing to the Q&As. So I'm just going to jump across now to my my notes here. So hopefully you can all see what I was showing on the screen not long ago, which is this the learning outcomes for L4M3. So the first learning outcome is all about understanding about formation of contracts, etc. But I said I wanted you to understand the broader context. So just to make sure that everyone can unmute themselves okay and we can hear you okay, I just wanted someone to take me through a very basic procurement cycle. So I'm going to start you off by saying when we're looking at procurement, we start off with identification of the need. So we identify the need, and that need normally comes from our end user. Okay, so our end user may raise some kind of a requisition and communicate that to us. What's the next thing? So can anyone maybe pop your hand up and I will ask you to unmute, but anyone tell me after we've identified the need, what's the next thing which we want to be doing? We have a very quiet group this morning. I'm sure we all know our procurement cycle. So can I encourage anyone to jump in before I show you? Okay, not yet. I will keep trying. Okay, so after we've identified the need, the next stage we're going to go through is we define the need. And we define our need through our specification. Okay, so who can tell me what types of specifications we have? There's two which you need to be aware of for this module. So your types of specification. Hi.
We've got like 2 specifications.
Yeah. What are the 2 types?
The performance and the conformance specifications.
Okay, good. So our performance, and just for the case of exams, in case it's phrased a different way, performance, they can also call that a functional specification. And then, like you said, a conformance, which might also be known as a technical specification. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about specifications as we go through our different learning outcomes. Now, after we've defined our need, we do all the things around the business case, do we have the budget, all those kind of things. But we also want to understand the terms under which we're willing to contract. So we develop all our documents, and this will include our contract. Okay. Then we have to say, well, are there potential suppliers who can actually meet our requirements? So we go and we do a bit of market sourcing. After we've sourced the market, we now want to understand, are these suppliers able to actually meet our requirements? So we do supplier appraisal. And that's where, things like your 10Cs will come into place. So you're saying, can they meet your current and your future needs? We then have our RFQ, RFP type process, and then we should have some form of negotiation. We then go into an award, and then all the bits of contract management. So within contract management, we talk about supplier relationship management, performance management, and all these other things. And then, of course, we've got all these aspects of receipting of goods and all those kind of things. So I'll just call this a wider kind of asset management type part. And then we go back around our cycle. Now, the reason I wanted to quickly run you through this is to make sure you understand the context of how your modules work. So when we look at L4M1, that is a whole cycle module. And you'll find that when you're doing L4M1, you need to know a little bit about each of these different steps of the cycle. And then you move into your 6 credit modules. So you've got L4M2, which is your business needs. You've got your developing contracts, which is this module here. So L4M3. Then you've got your ethical and responsible sourcing. So we're going to go around here for our L4M4. L4M5 is your negotiation. M6 is your relationship management. And then M7 is your whole life asset management. And then you would normally finish off with L4M8, which is your kind of integrative unit. So purchasing and supply and practice. Again, it goes around the whole cycle, a bit like L4M1, but it's a lot more focused on application. So if you understand the context of these modules, then you'll also know that, in this module here, when we're thinking about contract, we're thinking of it in relation to, our specifications and what needs to be achieved. But also when we get into things like contract management, the contract is very relevant because, if we're not getting the level of performance we expected, we're going to go back and see what we can enforce under the terms of our contract. So that's just a very quick overview of how this module is structured. So we're going to start off by now just talking around a bit of L4M1. And so L4M1 is all about the legal issues that relate to the formation of contracts. And like I said, the questions are all going to come from this learning outcome. So what I would normally do is by the time you're doing revision, is to just go down this kind of a list and say, okay, can you talk about each of these different elements? So when we're talking about invitation to tender, request for quotation, do we know what that is? Do we know what the specification is? And we can talk about that in the context of a contract. So this first part, 1.1, I'll just talk about this, at a kind of high level, and then we'll jump into the larger part of this first learning outcome, which is about the formation of contracts. So before we talk about formation, we've got to understand what actually goes into our contractual document. And if you looked at the beginning of the cycle we just talked about, we said that we start off by a need coming from our end user, then we need to define that need with our specification. And so this specification, our second point here, is the document which we use to communicate with our end users. So we're agreeing what our requirement is with them. And then it's also what we then take out to our potential suppliers. So we're telling them this is what we're going to need. And after we've communicated it to our potential suppliers, by the time we do our RFQ, RFP type process, we're using that as the baseline for what our suppliers respond against. And then when we're dealing with award, we want to see how compliant they are with it. And then in contract management, are they actually fulfilling those requirements? So our specification is a really critical document which we have in our toolkit. So we heard earlier on that we have two types of specification. We have our performance specification, and then we have our conformance. So can someone tell us, what is the difference between these two types of specifications? Who wants to just explain to us, and then we can try and break it down in a bit more detail? Okay, Roa, do you want to go ahead? You can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
The difference between performance and conformance, that performance is performance that care about the output of the item, and the performance focus on all the material, the design, the output, all of this. You give it to the supplier and to design the item with your specification.
Yeah, so just simplifying that, with our conformance one, it's explaining what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Okay, so if I normally use an example of a door, and if I say, okay, I need to hold my a door open. If I am giving a conformance specification, I might say that I need to have a wooden triangular shaped doorstop. And we'd give the type of wood, we'd give the dimension. So we'd say maybe it needs to be 5 centimeters long, 3 centimeters tall, a right angled triangle, 2 centimeters wide, etc. So whichever supplier we end up awarding to, we should expect an almost identical product. Whereas with the performance specification, what we're saying is, well, we need something which is going to hold open this door. And that's the only thing we're telling. We're telling them, the suppliers, what the outcome needs to be. Okay, so we're focusing on the output or the outcome, and I'm saying I need a door held open. Some suppliers may come back to us with a wooden doorstop. Some may come with a rubber doorstop, but actually we may get a lot more innovation. So some suppliers may come with a hook, which can hold open the door. Other suppliers may come with some kind of a magnetic device. So, we look at how we have these kind of electromagnetic door holders and things like that. So you get a much wider range of potential solutions. So it's important that we understand, why we would go for different types of specifications, and it depends on what we're trying to achieve. If we are the experts, we are more likely to go with conformance specs because we can tell the supplier what we need to achieve. If we are dealing in a sector, for example, public sector, where we have to really demonstrate, why was one solution better than the other, and just our opinion and our preference isn't enough. In the private sector, if we have a preference for a particular product or solution, we can choose it. And in the public sector, you've got to have grounds for why you're choosing one particular solution over another. And that's why in the public sector, you tend to see a lot more conformance specifications than performance. So we should be aware of those different types when we are talking about specifications. And if we're talking about innovation, increasing the potential supply base, because by allowing anyone who can meet our requirement, hold open our door, even someone who makes blocks or bricks, they could decide to tender, because you can put a stone in front of a door and it's going to hold it open. So there are some disadvantages of performance specifications. You get a much wider range of solutions, which can be a good thing, but actually it's a lot more different things to evaluate. You could also get unexpected solutions, and typically as well, you might end up with what we call supplier lock-in. So you go with a particular supplier's performance because they came with that innovation. Maybe they're the ones with the know-how of that particular way. When you want to switch to suppliers to another supplier, it can be a bit of a challenge. So that's just a little bit around our types of specifications. Next question is, what makes a good specification? So what are the kind of attributes of a good specification? So anyone want to volunteer with anything? Okay, not a trick question. I will start you off. A good specification where it must be clear, right? It must be clear what we are trying to achieve. Okay, because if we are not clear on the requirement, at the end of the day, as we go around the cycle, we award, we're now not going to be getting the solution which we actually want. And also suppliers aren't going to be clear on what they're bidding on. You get a lot more questions throughout the process, but ultimately you may fail to achieve your wider objective.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Yeah. How are you, William? Thank you so much. Nice to listen to you.
Where from?
I am from United Arab Emirates.
Good. So do you want to tell us a bit more about a good specification, please?
Yeah, for sure, because I'm suffering every day.
Sure. Most of us are, yes.
So, yeah, as you said, it must be clear.
Yeah.
It must be commercially viable.
Okay. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, because see, if commercially, if we are bounded to buy some product, okay, which is specified from the client specification with very high spec, and in the contract, the price given for that, like, I mean, they are asking for Mercedes and giving us for something like, a cheap car, a cheap brand. Toyota or something. So the commercially viability must be there.
Okay.
Specification plus availability.
And what I will do there is just link that to our 5 rights. Okay. Yeah. So when we're talking about the right quality, quantity, etc., the right price, it must fit within our budget, and linked to the quality. Sometimes we over specify. So we go and we put things in there, really tight tolerances, etc. But it's not necessary, and actually then as a procurement team, we are the ones who are, not adding value to our organization, because we only want the quality of what we need. Anything above that, effectively, we're putting in cost, which isn't going to bring additional value to the organization, because perhaps our end customer doesn't value it. Now, I will kind of put that commercially viable under the 5 rights, and those are the considerations of what we need to put into our specification. So if I narrow my question a little bit more and say, if we are writing a specification, and we've done our business case, we understand some of the aspects of commerciality, etc. What do we want to end up with? So we want to end up with something which is fit for purpose, but some of the other elements which we want to talk about, let's just see what other comments we've got. I saw a hand pop up and go down. Yeah, Nahid, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Yes, hello. This is Nahid from Sudan. I think what makes a good specification, maybe should it be not branded, or should it be standardized? That's what I think.
Yeah, in fact, we'll talk about standardization in a way. But I think you're very right. When we talk about unbranded, we don't want to narrow our supply market to a particular supplier or brand. Yeah, good. Any other contributions? How long should our specification be? Tanda, do you want to come in with something?
I think I can try.
Yeah.
A good specification should firstly identify the requirements, which is the description of what is particularly needed. So as you said, a good specification should be clear to actually focus on the goal of what we are currently needing. So after the identification has been done, which is, I believe, it's the description of what is requested, and then we should now get a method of identifying the end user should now identify more of specifically making it clear as to understanding what we need. So now the end result, I believe that it should be of good quality of our need, and basically more of negotiating of the good quality we need. I believe so. I'm not sure, but I'm just guessing.
Yeah, no, you're right. And the key thing is, if we go back to say, the purpose of our specification, we agree with our end user, right? So firstly, we've got to make sure it's clear and comprehensive. Our end user must agree with us that we've covered everything, because otherwise we don't fulfill their needs. And the whole point of the procurement cycle is to fulfill our end users' needs. But then secondly, we've got to make sure our supplier is clear on what we need. Otherwise, there may be wastage, they may overdo it, they may actually come up with something which is below our requirements as well. So it should be comprehensive of all the different requirements we need. Now, the temptation now is for people to write really long specifications. So we also say that they should be concise. The longer you make a specification, the more chance you have that you're going to contradict yourself at some point during that process. Okay, Nonsidusa, you have a question or a comment, actually?
Oh, I just wanted to add on.
Yep. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, you've just said it all. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's good. The other thing I would just add briefly is there's this temptation when we're writing our specs that people want to show off all their vocabulary and everything they need. Write these specifications simply. So we also say they should be free from jargon. Okay, so any jargon or these kind of words, all they're going to do is to serve to confuse things or make it unclear what our requirements are. Okay, Chad, do you want to come in?
Hi, William.
Hello.
Yes, so just in terms of the performance, we need to make it clear what you want to achieve in terms of your KPIs and your targets. That has to be stated quite clearly.
Yeah, and actually, I will put it here, but I would see that as a kind of a sister to our specification, right? So we have our specification says this is what we need, and then we talk about well how do we actually measure that performance, and we will talk about in fact maybe let's just very quickly we will talk about it in a lot more detail. But when we set what our performance requirements are, we're going to talk about key performance indicators, and it's very important when we have a KPI to say how do we actually judge performance? We're going to have our qualitative and our quantitative factors, which we'll talk about in a moment. But how do you also support continuous improvement? if you're doing a specification and it's a 2-year, 3-year contract, you expect their performance to evolve over time. You don't expect a supplier to stand still. And how do you support that? And that's where our KPIs come into play. They help our contract and our specification be a moving document. Okay. Good. Okay, so we've kind of talked on specs a little bit, and what it means is all these documents here, and we'll talk about things like health and safety and all those things, but they will all form some aspect of our contract. So our specifications, we have to be very careful and clear that we don't contradict what our requirement is through terms in our contract. So normally when you have a contract pack, you'll have the specification as an annex, as an appendix. You'll have other annexes. So you have things about complying with health and safety rules, any requirements for things like access, which you might need. You certainly would include things around non-disclosure, confidentiality, especially if you've got commercial information in your contract. You might have restrictions on the use of subcontractors, and normally you'd have a clause which says something along the lines of you can't subcontract unless previously agreed. And then we get into the contractual part, which is a contract is an agreement between two parties. So if this is us, this is our supplier, and then they have a subcontractor, the problem we have is that if the subcontractor messes up, the law says we can't sue them because we don't have a contract with them. So what we would normally say is our supplier must make sure they have contractual clauses, which, but if they do subcontract, that they bind their subcontractor by the same terms which we have bound them by. So that means that if something goes wrong, we can just sue this supplier, and they in turn would sue those people, and then the money should flow back this way, or at least whatever the remedy we're trying to get is. Okay, so this first learning outcome is just to understand the context that when we're dealing with a commercial agreement, we'll have a specification, we'll have key terms around that. There'll be a process involved, so we'll request them to bid and all those kind of things, and then we'll have a whole load of schedules at the back. And we're going to touch on all of these in a little bit more detail as we go through this session. The big one now is to say, well, what exactly is a contract, and how is a contract formed? What is this issue of a battle of the forms? Can a contract be formed orally, or must it be in writing? And what happens about things which we say in the process of forming our contract, and we call those representations. So let's just spend 10 or 15 minutes looking at contract formation. Okay, so I will just mute anyone who's not muted, and then ask who wants to pop their hand up and tell us, what are the fundamentals of contract formation? If I tell you what are the requirements for us to have a valid contract, what would you tell me? This one, I expect a number of you must know this. This is the fundamental of this module. So, okay, keep your hand up. I'm going to come back to you. So, Joanna, do you want to start this off? Oh, you popped your hand back down, Joanna. Do you want to have a go, or you're not so sure now? Okay, Chad, do you want to start us off, Chad, then? What's the starting point when we're forming a contract?
Yes, look, there's obviously your basic rules or categories of a contract formation. That would be your offer, your acceptance.
Okay, so I'll slow you down a bit. We have an offer, and then you've also told me about an acceptance. So those are two of, and people will talk to you about either saying, oh, there's 3 key elements, or some people talk to you about there being 5 or 6. Okay, they're all the same. In strictly speaking, in law, there's 3 things you need for a contract to be valid, and then there's other things that could say that even if you've got those 3 things, it may become invalid. So we're going to look at all of those different things. So tell me, Chad, what is an offer?
Well, it's basically,
sounds simple, right? It's gone.
Sorry, it's basically someone offering, a statement, basically, making an offer to provide, how can I say, a service or product.
Yeah. So it's offer to buy, it's an offer to sell, or it's offer to provide a service. Now, the key thing about an offer is it must be capable of being accepted. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that there are some things which are not an offer. So not, for example, what we call an invitation to treat, or an invitation to tender, or an advert. Okay, so what the law says is if you just tell someone, and this is what we often do in procurement, we are looking at buying, tables and chairs, make us an offer and we'll consider it. What we have just said is not an offer. We have invited people to make us an offer, and that's what we call an invitation to treat or an invitation to tender. By telling them, give us an offer. So when a supplier sends us their offer under a tender process, we have the ability to accept or reject all. And this is a really important concept. It means that if we go into a shop and we see items displayed with a price next to it, and we take it to the till and they tell us, oh, sorry, it was meant to have an extra 0 on the end. We can't now turn around and insist and say, no, it was up for sale at that point, and therefore you have to sell it to me at that price. Because actually what's happening is the display of goods in a shop is what we call an invitation to treat. It's just an advert. Okay, and the price which they put there is just a suggested price to say, if you offer us this, we're likely to accept it. But that's why, when you get to a till, they can actually turn around and reject it and say no. Similarly, if power goes down at a supermarket, the manager can turn around and just give you an offer at any price. Now, a lot of people would turn around and say, well, hang on, but we've been to a shop before and something was mispriced and the shop sold it to us at that price. That is up to the shop. The law would not require them to do so. In the same way, if you were selling your car and you put a price up in the window and someone knocks on your door and says, look, here's the money, give me your car keys, you're entitled to reject it because you've just advertised it and you've suggested that they offer you that kind of price, but you can decide to accept or reject all these kind of offers. Okay. Now, an offer, there's lots of different things around an offer. I'm just going to highlight a few things. So if I ask you, when does an offer end? You can tell me, Simone. When does an offer end?
There's a few ways in which an offer would cease to exist. I think the most obvious one would be death. If we had to withdraw it, if it were to lapse, perhaps, and then obviously acceptance, I think, is the last one, because if we accept an offer, the offer essentially comes to an end. Yeah,
good. A couple I'll just add on. After acceptance, obviously, if it's rejected, and this is obviously an important point when you do negotiation, if someone gives you an offer, you don't just reject it. You can ask clarification questions, but if you say no, then that offer is gone. You can't say no and then 5 minutes later say, okay, no, actually I accept your original offer. That original offer is gone as soon as it's rejected. And similarly, with what we call a counteroffer. We're going to talk about a counteroffer in a little bit of time. You mentioned death, and obviously the equivalent of death, if it is a company, is insolvency. Okay, so any offers which are open at the point that someone passed or a company goes into insolvency, they are null and void. Okay. Now, the other thing is that all these things, when we talk about an offer, etc., it's got to be definite, it's got to be clear, but it can be verbal, and we're going to talk about that in a moment now when we look at the second part. So Chad told us we had offer and we had acceptance. I'll just highlight something. These two together are what we call an agreement. Okay. Now, the difference between an agreement and a contract is an agreement is not legally binding. Okay, so you can have an agreement, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can go to court to enforce the agreement. And we're going to talk about the next bit, which you need to make that agreement into a contract in a moment. Now, because it's an agreement, it's what we call a meeting of minds. So for those of you who like your Latin, we have this phrase called consensus ad idem, okay, which means a meeting of minds. So two parties come together and they must be agreeing on the same thing. And that's why the law would say if there was a mistake, and there was, some old cases which talk about things like a horse and a house. And then one party thought they were, buying a horse. They thought they were selling their horse, and the other party thought they were buying the house of the other one. Now that's a clear mistake. There's confusion. There was never any meeting of minds. So even though there was an offer and acceptance and all those kind of things, because the underlying subject was not agreed, they never had a meeting of minds. It was not a contract. Okay, so who can tell me about acceptance? What is acceptance? If I wanted that defined. Okay, Simone?
Well, obviously, acceptance can only happen whilst the offer is still standing, like you said. So, I mean, that's the only way. And then secondly, I think it's important to remember that it needs to be made by someone with sound mind. You need to be able to make those decisions. So not a minor, no mental disabilities, etc.
I'm just going to drop down here and write what you're talking about, which is capacity. And that's something which could make the contract invalid, yes. But before we do that, how would you accept if I said to you, I will sell you my phone. So this is a definite offer. I will sell you my phone for, 20,000 rand.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be verbal or non-verbal. Accepting. Yeah. So it could be in writing, or it could be oral acceptance, verbal acceptance.
So I'm just going to say the second point, which is it can be in writing. Sorry, my writing is going all off now. So it can be in writing or verbally, okay? But the important point of this is that silence alone does not equal acceptance. Okay, so if someone tells you, okay, you buy something online, and there was a case on this, you buy something online with your card, and let's say you bought a laptop, and when your laptop gets shipped to you, it gets shipped to the printer, and they got a little note in there which says, if we don't hear anything from you, we're assuming that you've accepted this printer, and we're going to bill your card, another 30,000 rand. That would not be that wouldn't constitute acceptance. Just because you don't say anything. You didn't request it. Silence alone is never acceptance. However, conduct is. So if you now unpack this printer and you start to use it, let me just write that clearly. If you start to unpack it and you start to use it, then your conduct is indicating acceptance. Just like if you're having a negotiation with someone over a product, my phone, for example, and you take it out of my hands and walk away, then everyone would say, well, the fact that you've taken it and you've gone off with it, that indicates that you accepted, whatever those terms were. Okay. Now, the most important point. Okay, Chepa, do you want to come in? Hang on, there we are. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Sorry, will you be speaking to me?
No, Chepa will put their hand up, but sorry. They are still muted. Let's see if we can help them out. Okay, whilst you should be able to unmute, but I will now just quickly give you the first one, my main point. And this is really the most fundamental thing about acceptance. And if you can remember this, everything else falls into place. Acceptance must be an unconditional assent. Okay, what does that mean? Right? It means that you are agreeing with no other conditions. And the safest way to do this is just by saying yes or I accept. If we're using my example on my phone, if I said, I was selling a phone for 20,000, and you turned around to me and said, okay, as long as you clear it, as long as you wipe it before you give it to me, that is not acceptance. We don't have anything called it conditional acceptance under our standard contract law. That's what we'd call a counteroffer. And a counteroffer means you've rejected my initial offer and you've presented a new offer which says, I'll buy your phone for 20,000 as long as it's cleared before. So anytime anyone introduces any new term, we're actually seeing there be a rejection and a new offer being put on the table. Okay. So that's the fundamental thing we should remember about acceptance. It must be unconditional, and there's no requirement for it to be in writing. It can be verbally, and it can even be by your behavior, by your conduct, but silence alone never is the same as acceptance. I'm just going to draw you something now. One of the things you need to be aware of is something called the battle of the forms. And what is the battle of the forms all about? Let me just think of what else I'm going to have to put in. Let's just drop down a couple of pages, and I'm just going to say battle of the forms. Okay, so who can tell me what we mean by battle of the forms? Okay, a couple of people have their hands up. Let's have a look. Jennifer, let's see, is your sound working now? No. Okay, Simone, do you want to talk us through Battle of the Forms?
Yeah, Battle of the Forms is essentially, it's got to do with the terms and conditions, and which terms and conditions will stand at the end of the day. Would it be the supplier or would it be the purchaser? Okay. So what essentially happens is that, let's take, say for instance, I'm buying, I don't know, steel from a supplier, and I issue my, they issued their quotation. Their quotation is going to have their terms and conditions on, and I'm going to issue an order, a purchase order, which would have my terms and conditions on, and so it would carry on until delivery. And by that point, they would say usually that the supplier's terms and conditions would then stand because of the delivery note, but there could also be, I don't know, perhaps in the contract or in the agreement, we as a purchaser or as a buyer could ensure that our terms and conditions, I don't know, make, how do you call it?
Yeah, very difficult to do
yes.
with the way you've described it. And that's why we talk about actions to avoid a battle of the forms type of situation. So like you said, it's all about, whose terms and conditions are going to govern our contract. And we end up in this battle between us, the buyer, and the supplier. And all that we're saying is, just like I said, a counteroffer rejects the original offer and presents a new one. So because we don't have anyone saying, I accept, we end up with this battle of the forms. So you may send a request for quotation or something, and you've got your terms with it, right? A supplier may then send their quotation. When they send their quotation, it has the supplier's terms on it. You might then send a purchase order, okay? And of course, your purchase order will have your terms on it. Then the supplier may send an order acknowledgement, and then they have their supplier's terms on it. Now, what often happens is, buying organizations, you just file this thing away and, everything's all well and good, you think. However, the principle of the battle of the forms is saying, well, you've just had a counteroffer from them with their terms on it. If you do nothing and you start to accept their goods, your conduct, remember I said, silence isn't acceptance, but your conduct will be, if you start accepting their goods from them. Now, after they've sent this order acknowledgement, they're going to send the goods. And of course, the goods come with a delivery note, and the delivery note are all based on the supplier's terms. Okay, and it's only when there's an issue which comes up, that we have this realization that, hang on, we gave you a purchase order, so it's based on our terms, and the supplier turned around and said, well, no, we never accepted that. We sent you an order acknowledgement with our terms, and you never came back with anything on it. And so this is one of the critical issues of understanding, Battle of the Forms. How do you get around this? Well, you want to have some kind of finality. If it's a tender process, you actually give them a contract, and you make them sign that contract. And it basically says on this contract that no further changes unless agreed in writing. There's other things you can do. When the deliveries come, you can have a stamp which says accepted on buyer's terms. Okay, then if the supplier doesn't do anything, then you fired the last shot per se. So that means that your terms would prevail. So these are the kind of things which you want to be really understanding when it comes to contracting, that actually has a contract been formed, and when was the contract formed, and whose terms applied. Okay, so this is a very simple illustration of the Battle of the Forms. Okay, cool. So finishing off on our contract formation, we had offer, we have acceptance. I told you those two give us an agreement. We then need to add something which we call consideration. So who can tell me, what is consideration? Okay, Simone, okay, we've got a few actually. Let's hear from Roa. We've not heard from you for a while. So what is consideration? Oh, we've lost you. Okay, so anyone else wants to tell me what is consideration? Let's go with, okay, Chad, do you want to tell us what is consideration?
William, in a nutshell, it's basically a form of payment, whether that be of monetary value or some sort of service or bartering type of agreement.
Yes, so we would just say there's something of value. Okay, and it can have any value at all, and this is the key thing, right? We say consideration must be sufficient, but not necessarily adequate. What does that mean? Anyone understand what that means? Consideration must be sufficient, but not necessarily adequate.
Could it perhaps mean that the payment doesn't necessarily have to be like the same value? I don't know, perhaps that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, exactly. When we're dealing consideration, what it basically says is that, if you do a bad deal, you can't go to court and say, oh, hang on, I sold my car for 10,000 rand, it was worth 50,000, I was desperate, so I need the money, so I want you now to give order that I get paid more. Right? The court's not going to get involved if you do a bad deal. So they're just going to say, did you get something of value? 10,000 is value, even 1 rand is value. So as long as you've got something of value, doesn't matter what your circumstance was, the court's not going to get involved. They're going to say there was consideration, therefore your agreement is now a legally binding contract. Okay. Now there are things which can make a contract invalid. So if you were under duress, if they were threatening you, threatening your family, all those kind of things, then of course you would turn around and say you only went into this not of your own free will. And that would be a way for you to get out of the contract. But if it was just that, you were in bad financial situation, so you sold something cheap, well, unfortunately, the court's not going to get involved. They're going to say you got value. It may not be adequate value. It may not represent what the thing is worth, but it's still sufficient because it is something of value. Okay, so it must be sufficient, not necessarily adequate. The other things which we would say is it can't be, and so let me do a not equals. So it cannot be something which is an existing obligation. Okay, so if you turn around and there's a thief who grabs your wallet or whatever, and you see a policeman, you tell them arrest them, and they say, okay, well, arrest them, but you've got to pay me 5,000, and they say sure, and they go ahead, they arrest them, they come back for their money, and you choose to not pay them, they can't take you to court because it's their pre-existing obligation, right? So if it's already someone's job, it's the same thing. Why employment contracts say you do everything in your job description plus anything else your employer requires. You can't turn around and say, well, I've done some additional things, I want some extra money. The court would say, oh no, it's your obligation under your employment contract to do whatever your employer requires of you. Okay. And then also the other thing is past consideration isn't sufficient. So you can't say, oh, I overpaid in the past, and therefore, I should be getting some of this value back now as some kind of credit. Okay. Right, so those are the three things now which give us our binding contract. Then there's a few things which could make it invalid. And we heard of capacity earlier on, and it was described quite nicely, I think. So when we say capacity, that means that the individual must have the ability to contract, which means that they must be of legal age. Okay, it means they must be of sound mind, which means that if they have a learning disability, mental illness, if they have, if they're absolutely intoxicated, which means they must be very drunk or high on drugs or things like that, then you would say they don't have capacity, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can have a glass of wine and get out of a contract. It must be clear, and that's why they use that legal term. You must be absolutely intoxicated, which means you're so drunk it's clear to everyone around you that you're not capable of making good judgment. And even in those cases, when you sober up, you need to take proactive actions as soon as you realize that you've gone into this kind of contract. Now, from a corporate perspective, we say they must have authority, and there's something you should be aware of called deemed authority, okay? So anyone who is a director or what we call an officer of a company has the ability to contract. So your HR director could sign off on huge capital equipment expenditure. And if a supplier has their signature or their consent, your company can't turn around and say, oh, well, actually, this HR director doesn't have that authority. As long as they're a director, a third party can always assume that they have authority to contract. And the other people who we can also assume have authority to contract are people like us, people in procurement. If you get something from a procurement officer, procurement manager, anyone, a buyer, the third party is entitled to assume that buyer had the authority to contract. Now, if it says, for example, a junior buyer and it's a huge contract, then the expectation is that that they should be doing some kind of check on that. Okay, so we've got to have capacity, and then the last one I will talk to you briefly about is the intention to create a legal relationship, okay? Which basically means we must intend to contract. What this rules out is social settings. So if you have a bet with friends and you lose the bet, you don't pay them, and they try to take you to court, the court's going to say, no, this is a social setting. And this is a really interesting one as well. If you lend money to your sibling or parents or anything else like that, and then later you now say they haven't paid you back, you go to court, a court will, generally speaking, throw it out. They'll turn around and say, no, hang on, this is not a social, this is not an environment where you intended to create a legal relationship. This is between relatives, it's a social arrangement, and the court doesn't have jurisdiction over those kind of social arrangements. So, whereas earlier on we said contracts don't need to be in writing, all those kind of things, if you are dealing with a family member, then that's the kind of situation where you need to be a little bit more careful, because if you want to make it legally binding, you're going to have to demonstrate to a court that you really intended it to be a legal relationship. So that's just one thing just to bear in mind. It is always assumed that there's intention to create a legal relationship in a business-to-business concept. So when two companies are dealing with each other and they come to some kind of agreement, there's consideration, and maybe I'll just add this bit here. Consideration must be provided by both parties, okay? So if one party is doing something for free, it's a favor, okay? You cannot legally bind them. And that's another thing. If I give an example of, you go to a mechanic to get your car fixed, and they give you a quote, they tell you it's going to cost you, 30,000 Rand to fix your car. You tell them go ahead, and now when you come to collect it, you tell them, oh, look, I've only got 20,000. Will they accept it or not? And they take that 20,000, and they see you out, later in the night in the bar spending lots of money. They can say no, they want the extra 10,000 because your original contract was for 30,000. And the court will always say, well, you tried to now form a second contract, which was that they give you 10,000 back. What did you give them in return? If you didn't give them anything of value, then that's not a contract, it's an agreement. So, always make sure there's something of value. You could decide to sing a song for them, it doesn't matter how good your singing is, that is something of value. As long as you can say the other party has got something of value, you've provided the foundation of a contract. So just remember, both sides must provide something of value. So that's the key elements around this formation of contracts. We also mentioned this aspect of duress. People who intend to go into a legal relationship must go in off their own free will. Okay, so if someone is being threatened, your job's being threatened. If you don't do this, you're going to lose your job. All those kind of things. You would argue that you were under duress. You didn't have an intent to create a legal relationship. So those are the 5 key things, and the reason why we know they can ask us about these things is when we come back up to our syllabus, we can see there's offer, acceptance, consideration, intention to create legal relations, and capacity to contract. So you must be able to know and talk about all those different things. You can be asked the kind of questions of what we just looked at now. We've looked at Battle of the Forms, and the implication of Battle of the Forms is that you may end up being on your supplier's terms. And an example of this is things like payment terms or risk. You might have a clause which says, if things go wrong, they are responsible, they pay for it, and they would have a clause which says they have no liability in those kind of situations, and that's a big risk for you. That's why we want to make sure we're contracting on our terms. So not only do we make sure we write good contracts, but we want to make sure that we are engaged with them under our own terms. Okay, I'm just going to touch on a few more of these things, and then give a few minutes for any questions, and then we'll take a short break. Just going to talk on oral contracts, and that's going to link to representations. Now we said that a contract does not need to be in writing. Okay. Now the risk, if your contract is not in writing, is that when it comes down to the business end of things, something goes wrong, you go to court, the court's going to say, okay, show to me or prove to us that what you're saying is true. And so it becomes the situation of he said, she said. Okay, so who is actually telling the truth, and what was the original agreement? So that's one of the big risks of contracting orally. You can do it, but now the situation comes down to who's telling the truth. Everyone's going to start calling different witnesses who may have different recollections, and it becomes a bit messy. So that's why we generally want to make sure our contracts are in writing. Now there is this thing called a representation. Okay, so even if we have a written contract, we're buying a car or something like that, we may ask a few key questions just before we buy this vehicle. We ask, has it been serviced recently? Have you had any issues with it in the last 6 months? All those kind of questions which you may ask. Now the response to those questions are what we call representations, and they may form part of the contract. So even though you have a written contract, what you're told may also form part of that contract. Now, if you don't want that to happen, you will have a clause in your written contract which says, anything else discussed, etc., does not form part of this contract, and this written document represents all terms and conditions which are going to apply. But if that's not the case, then what people say around the time a contract is formed, they form part of the terms. Now, why do we care? Well, what happens if we've been told a lie? Okay, so a misrepresentation. A misrepresentation is a false statement of fact. Okay, now that's really important as well to understand. If it is an opinion, so if someone says, in my opinion, this is the best product in the world, that is not a misrepresentation because they've told you it's an opinion. And similarly, we've got to be aware of what we call advertising puff. If someone is selling you something, you can expect them to talk it up, right? They're not going to tell you, oh, this is a rubbish product. They're going to embellish their story. And a court understands that, and it should be understood in general principles that you can expect that. And so this principle of caveat emptor applies. Okay, anyone tell me what we mean by caveat emptor? No one come across this term? Okay, Joanna? Do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah. So, Joanna, what is caveat emptor? I can see you're unmuted, but for some reason we're not hearing anything. Edmore, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, sure. Let the buyer beware.
Yeah, buyer beware. So what does that mean? So someone's told you some information and then we're saying, well, even if they've told you something, caveat emptor, beware. What does that mean you should do? Yeah, what do you do? What does caveat emptor mean? It says buyer beware is our translation. But so in practice, what do we do?
We perform due diligence before making any transaction.
Exactly. So what the court is saying is someone tells you it's in good running order. Did you drive it? If you're buying a car, did you test drive it? If you don't do your basic checks, then you are being negligent. So the court is going to say, well, look, if you had the ability to inspect, now, of course, hidden defects, that's not your fault. But if you have the ability to inspect something, you must do it. So buyers beware. So that's where misrepresentation comes in. It's where there's a false statement of fact. Now, before a court turns around and says that, are we going to cancel this contract and give you compensation? There's a few things they want to consider, right? The first thing they want to say is, when was the statement made? Okay, so if someone told you this car's in great running order, and that was 6 months ago, you went away to think about it and you came back and you said, oh, is that offer still on? Is that vehicle still for sale? And they say, yeah, sure. And you go and do your deal, but you don't ask that question again. They would say, well, actually, it's remote. That statement was too far away for it to now apply to this contract. They also want to know, was it put in writing after? If there's an email or something along the time which confirms they said that, then that's going to add more weight to it. The importance. So the importance of the representation to the buyer. So if you would have still gone ahead with the purchase, even if they had told you the truth, or if you've been, if the fact was the other way around, right? If you'd have still gone ahead with the procurement, then they would say, well, that's not grounds for you to not go ahead. did the other party tell you to check? So if they say, yeah, this is a really good condition, but get your own mechanic and do a check, then you can't rely on it. Hang on, speaking ahead of what I'm writing. Of course, if you know it's false, so if you actually knew that the representation was false, you can't now say, okay, hang on, you're going to use this to get something back further down the line. If you already knew it was false and they could prove that you knew it was false and you still went ahead, then you can't use that later to get compensation. Okay, so I just say buyer knew the representation was false. And then the final one is the expertise. Okay, so if you are a mechanic, okay, and someone is just selling you their car and they tell you it's in great condition, because you as a buyer are a mechanic, the court would say, well, hang on, you were in a good position of power here. You have the ability to do those checks, you have the expertise, and the same thing is things like art and all those kind of things. Now, there's three categories of misrepresentation you need to be aware of. There is what we call innocent misrepresentation. And that's where we would say the other party believed what they told you was true. Okay, in which case the contract is normally voided, everyone goes back to their original situation, and no one is going to be penalized. There's no damages normally payable with innocent. And that happens where you've got artwork and everyone thinks it's a genuine Picasso, everyone's told you it's genuine Picasso, and then something comes up further down the line where they say, well, hang on, this isn't real. Okay, and because the two parties believed it was, and maybe even an expert had said it's innocent, you give back the painting, they give you back your money, everyone's happy. The next one we have is negligent. That's where they've not bothered to make a check. They tell you, yeah, it's a genuine Picasso, but they never actually ever checked themselves. So if that's the case, why should they be giving you that kind of a representation? Okay, and then the final one is what we call fraudulent misrepresentation. They knew that they were telling you a lie. And those ones are obviously going to be looked at, in the hardest way by the court. Okay. So non-seducer, do you have a question or a comment? Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
I cannot see some of the words.
Oh, on the screen?
Yes, like, okay, point. The sixth one.
Sorry, so it says expertise of the parties.
And the buyers knew?
When the buyers knew the representation was false.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. I'll try and write a bit clearer. Okay. Good. So that so those are the key things to think about. Representation. When someone says something, it can still form part of the contract. So a little behind. So we're going to probably have a shorter break in a moment. I just want to finish off looking at. Ooh, got a bit of background noise. Let me just mute people. So just to finish off by looking at the kind of contractual agreements, you should just be aware, one-off purchases is effectively, you go off, you get the quotation, you buy it, and then you're finished, right? So you might use your purchase order, and that's what we call a standard contract. We'll look at that in a moment. But we could also have a framework agreement. Now, the key thing to remember here is that it says agreement. It doesn't say contract. So think of a framework agreement a bit like a big umbrella. And what you do with a framework is you say, okay, well, look, we want to agree all the key terms which we're going to have, but actually we're not really giving anyone any responsibility or liability that they must
deliver or provide anything. So it just saves time further down the line with negotiations, but also means that you've agreed certain terms, so you can allow end users to go ahead and do their procurements. So a framework arrangement or a framework agreement will always need some kind of a contractual activity to come further down the line. And that can happen in two ways. There can be what we call a call of contract. So a call of contract basically says, you agree with a provider that, okay, you're going to buy, I don't know, you're doing construction, you're buying bricks. So you'll say, we're going to buy, R1 million worth of bricks. And as and when, and that can be an estimate, but then as and when you use it, you call off against that contract. And you'd ask them to be delivering, at whatever schedule you need underneath that call off. You could do mini competition. So your framework may have, 5 different providers on it. So, let's say a framework for training. You may have 4 or 5 different providers who can provide you the training. As and when you have a requirement, you would just tell them all to quote, based on whatever your new requirement is, 3 days training on contract management. You'd get your different quotes in. And whichever one you want to go with, you just issue some kind of an acceptance letter. And because you've already agreed the key terms in your framework arrangement, you don't have to go back and negotiate those kind of things. So it would include things like payment terms. It could include volumes. It could include pricing, but it depends on what kind of framework you're going with. We should also just be aware of difference between goods and services. So services being intangible, etc. That there's going to be elements of how we manage that through a service level agreement, and that will link into some of these kind of performance indicators, which we'll touch on in learning outcome 2. And then finally, the contracts for the hire and leasing of assets. Where you don't own it, there's normally 2 key ones you can have. A finance lease, which is basically where you are effectively you pay. The finance company is financing it. They give you the money for it, and you're paying them, and you're responsible for the maintenance and all the other elements of your asset. And then you may also have an operating lease, which would give you, sorry, there we are, an operating lease where you normally have it for a period of time. There'll be limits on, for example, if it's a car, how many miles can you drive a year? But actually, a lot of the service and maintenance, etc., will come in underneath the lease provider. Okay. So what I will do now, does anyone have any questions on this first learning outcome? So looking at everything we've got in this left-hand column, maybe I didn't touch on the Vienna Convention, but effectively the Vienna Convention, you've got 94 countries who have ratified this agreement, which basically says, if you've got suppliers in 2 different countries, different jurisdictions, and it's not clear on whose contract law applies, it's going to be the buying organization's contract law which will apply. But it also has some things around offer and acceptance. So whereas we talked about acceptance being an unconditional assent, the Vienna Convention will say, well, actually, if it's not a major requirement, so it's like saying you're buying a car and someone says, as long as you've cleaned it before you hand it over, the Vienna Convention will say, well, that's not a major requirement, so it doesn't mean it's a counteroffer, it's just a conditional acceptance. So some little things come into play under international law, which may not necessarily be the case in your local legislation, and that's where the Vienna Convention comes into play. All right. Okay, Heather, do you want to go ahead?
I would like to ask if by any chance we're going to be able to get this presentation, or is there any YouTube channel that we can subscribe to and listen to it after this this meeting?
Sure. So I believe the recording will be shared by CIPS South Africa. I will make sure that these notes get sent out. So all these scribbles, hopefully you can make your own ones as you're going along as well. But if you can read my writing, you will get access to all the kind of notes which we are making as we go through. Okay. Chad, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, just a quick question. Just in terms of clarification with regard to the Vienna Convention, regarding your orders, I'm a bit unsure in terms of how should two parties from different countries and are those that are within the compliant convention, Vienna Convention of the parties, just in terms of how it links to, like, let's say, what agreed Incoterms these two parties would agree on, and how it's linked to, let's say, the CISG ruling, and how it's linked to, let's say, Incoterms, and if there is a disagreement, what takes precedence.
Okay, so think of so Incoterms effectively provide you with it's a bit like a type of specification, right? When you say something is X works or cost insurance freight, etc., it just means that instead of having to write out paragraphs or pages of when risk and title and all those other things move across, you can just write a very short phrase which is actually predefined in your Incoterms. So think of that as dealing with specific clauses around when risk and title transfer, so the obligations of the parties. Now, the Vienna Convention is basically saying, if you've got two parties and you've not said, this contract is based exclusively on the laws of, Republic of South Africa, for example, then actually you've got two different buyer and supplier in two different countries. How do you now decide, if something got, if you turned around and said, oh no, they didn't deliver on time, you're claiming damages, and they turn around and say, no, it's based on our contract, and you had a battle of the forms type situation. The question of, well, whose terms applied, you're going to go back to the Vienna Convention and say, well, actually, if your two countries are both signatories to the Vienna Convention, you're going to apply that international law. If they're not, then you have a bit of a problem and a debate to go through. And so the simplest way to try and get around this is just make sure your contracts are very clear that, as a buying organization, you want it to be in your legislation. Your supplier also wants it to be in theirs. And that's why when you've got two relatively balanced people, you may end up dealing with some kind of international law contract or a jurisdiction which is third party. Does that help?
It helps. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, great. So what I'll just do now is at 25 past. So if we just take a very quick refreshment break, I was going to give 15 minutes, but I've gone a little bit over where I wanted to be now. So if we can just take it's 26 past. So let's say at 35 we will continue. Hopefully I've got you all back now. So just before I go ahead, I can see there was a question in the chat from Joanna, which was asking about the difference between a one-off contract and a call-off contract. So I just want to maybe touch on that very quickly. So a one-off contract is effectively, when the two parties have come together. So just think of, you send out a request for quote, they send you their quotation, their proposal, and you go off and you create a contract between the two parties. That in itself is a one-off contract. The next time you procure from that party, you would have to go off and do another contract for that particular requirement. Now, on the other hand, when we do a call-off, what we do is we first, a call-off comes underneath a framework. So you first set up your framework, and that framework agreement will have the terms and the other things which you need to have in it, between the two parties. And then when you actually now want to create a contract, you would just complete normally an order form. Okay, and when you send that order form and it's accepted, then you are contracted underneath the terms which were set out in your framework. So you avoid the kind of battle of the form situation, because it's agreed that the framework governs that term and condition. Now, each time you now want to create a new contract, so if you have to buy from them again, you just send another order form. Okay, and those are what we call our call-offs. We're calling off requirements against our framework contracts. So you can, it shortens that process. You may have a 2-year framework where maybe you've agreed pricing, and just each time maybe an end user needs, for example, a new laptop. So you have an IT supplier, you agree prices for laptops, for an external mouse, external keyboard, all those kind of things. And there's a framework. You don't necessarily have to buy any from them, but if you do buy any, it's going to be governed by those terms. So now you can just tell all your staff, well, if you need a laptop, you get it from these guys, you just complete an order form and automatically it will create a contract. They will deliver to you the laptop, and we know the price, the terms, the lead times, all those other things which would have been set out in our framework. So Joanna, does that answer your question for you? Okay, I hope so. Okay, so let's have a look. Brilliant, good. So if we are now going, so I think we've answered the questions. Great. So if I now go back up to look at learning outcome 2. So Wange, do you have a question, comment? Please feel free to come in. No.
Yes, my question is around the formal framework agreement. I just want you to explain why a framework is not a contract.
Okay.
Because I feel like when you have a certain framework, it means you have an agreement between yourself and a supplier. So it is a contract, but then in the note, it says it's not a contract. Can you maybe explain?
So let me just then quickly break down frameworks for you. So a framework can happen under 2 purposes, right? It might be for a defined period, or it could be for a defined volume, or something along those lines, okay? But the framework has terms and conditions associated with it, but no party is bound to provide, to deliver, whatever those terms are, because you've not yet gone as far as saying, exactly how many are going to work. So if we had a framework agreement, which was, a 2-year framework for the provision of, let's say a 2-year framework for the provision of drinking water, okay? You might provide the supplier with an estimate of how much water you think your premises needs and all those kind of things. But actually what you'd be saying in that framework is you want to set define what the price is going to be for that period of time. And you will operate under a call-off, which means that each time you need your water to be restocked, you issue an order form or a request or requisition or something like that, and then they come and deliver, and that now will generate some kind of a order confirmation, and then your organization has to pay them. But if you then don't order anything for 2 months, that supplier couldn't now come and sue you and say, well, hang on, you breached the contract because you didn't order anything from me today. And similarly, a framework could have multiple people on it. So you may have 2 or 3 different water suppliers, and at different times you may be ordering from different ones, or you may be running different competitions between them. And we see that a lot when we are looking at aspects such as, when we're looking at assets such as services. So the example I use for training, you may have 3 different providers who train, could provide you with procurement training, but depending on what it is, you may issue a mini competition each time. So you would now say, okay, now I need 2 days specification writing training, and you would ask everyone in your framework to provide you with a quotation, and you would decide who you want to contract with then. So the contract only comes when you've defined that requirement and agreed to a particular volume or number of items or something like that. But the framework agreement is just saying, right, the 2 parties have agreed all the terms, but you've not necessarily said I'm ordering this many now at any particular point in time. Okay, and that's why I'm saying the difference between an agreement and a contract. I hope that answers, sorry, it's a bit of a roundabout answer, but does that answer your question?
I still understand it as a contract, but let me just go through my notes again.
So with a contract, so remember, a contract means that you can now sue the other party, for example, for breach. Okay. So if I have a framework which says I've got 3 providers who can give me training, and I get them all to sign my framework agreement, and then I don't give one of those providers any training work, can they sue me and say I've breached the contract? Yeah, and the answer is no, because we've not formed the contract yet. We've had an agreement with them that they are part of our framework, but we've not guaranteed them anything. And that's the key thing. That framework doesn't necessarily come with any kind of guarantee. It's as and when we call off. If we now send them an order and then we change our mind later, then we might be in breach, because we've formed the contract when we sent them the order underneath the framework. So just think of it as saving you the time of having to negotiate and agree terms each and every time you're going to have those kind of a discussion. Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Good. Okay. So let's look at learning outcome 2. Now, some of these aspects we have discussed as we were going through our first one. So, when we talked about, drafting specifications, we said, what makes a good specification? It should be clear. It's got to be concise. We've got to know exactly what we are requiring. So it's got to be comprehensive. We said free from jargon, value analyzed. So I had someone talking about, we've got to make sure that, whatever it is that we are procuring, we don't go above what our requirements are. So we think about our 5 rights. What is the quality we need? The quantity exception, we don't start asking for things and features which actually our end user doesn't value, because effectively we're going to cost, add cost into our product, which we have to either absorb or pass on to our customers. So that's going to affect our competitive advantage. Okay, so we draft our specifications, we use them to communicate with our suppliers. When we talk about standards, I think Chad mentioned Incoterms, for example. If we talk about ISO standards and things like that, we use them in our specifications because it shortens the amount we have to write. So remember, we said we want our specifications to be concise. So if we can have some kind of a standard, it will mean that the amount we have to write is reduced. And we also reduce the chance of us, writing conflicting information. We just say, they must be compliant, with ISO 13,000 or 14,001 or whatever. And we put those things in place, and it saves us saying, well, you must have, if it's 14,001, we don't have to talk about environmental management system and all those kind of things. Okay. Now, standardization is another thing which was brought up earlier on. Do we want our specifications to standardize things? Now, when we're dealing with technical specifications, generally speaking, we do, and we're trying to reduce what we call product proliferation. So slightly different features from different suppliers. If we buy from lots of different ones, we end up with a warehouse which has 100 things which do effectively the same thing, but they're all slightly different. So our stock levels go up. So we want to try and standardize requirements as much as possible. However, there are situations where we also have to take into account the changing nature of the market and the environment. And this happens, particularly when we're dealing with things like IT, that we want to have innovation. So if we want to have innovation from our markets, then actually we're going to start thinking about our functional specifications. And that will mean that we get a wider range of products, but actually we'll end up with that level of innovation which we were actually trying to achieve. So just in a question pop up about cost and price, and we will talk about that when we get into learning outcome 3 at the end, so 3.3, which is down there. Okay. The one I wanted to just touch on a little bit more in this 2.1 was understanding what we mean by our social and environmental criteria in specification, and that links back to things like sustainability. Okay, So if I ask you, when we talk about social criteria, can anyone tell me what do we mean by social environmental criteria? Or if I ask you, ethical sourcing, can anyone give me, a definition of what we mean by ethical sourcing? Okay, Simone?
Well, ethical sourcing would be, sourcing from suppliers that have sustainability and they use ethical standards, obviously. So it would be, say, for instance, if it was fishing, they source from, they use the correct procedures to fish, say, for instance. We're looking after the environment. We're not using children as labor. So that's basically ethical sourcing.
Yeah, and actually you kind of gave a nice range of examples, right? So when we think of ethical sourcing, we're essentially saying that we must, behave as buying organizations. We must behave in a way where we are not going to impact the ability of future generations to exist. Okay, and we think of two different factors, and you talked about, social standards. Okay, and you mentioned not using child labor and things like that. And you talked about, sustainable fishing. So, what's the impact on the environment as well? And so ultimately, we should be thinking about what we call the triple bottom line. Okay, and people can remember that as the 3 Ps. People, which is our social standards, profit, which is our economic, obviously we're there to support the objectives of our organization, and that includes profitability, and planet, which is the environmental factors. So we have to think of those 3 holistically. And if that's the case, that means that when we are thinking about specifications, we are going to do things like, value analyzing our specs, so that we're trying to make sure that we maximize the potential we can get out from the profit side. But also, we want to make sure that we have proper social standards and social requirements in there. Are our suppliers paying, minimum wages? Do they have safe operating environments? Are they fair? Do they allow unions to exist? And do they, engage fairly with their employees? And similarly, what are they doing in terms of of sustainability and environmental sustainability? Do they have a proper environmental management? What do they do with their waste products? Do they think of total life cycle costs and what do they do at end of life, or with end of life assets and things like that? So there's a whole range of things that we want to be thinking about, and we have the ability through our specifications to make a difference and to communicate with our suppliers and our wider supply chain about our requirements and what those requirements might be. Okay, so that's why we might think about making sure that we have these kind of criteria in our specifications. Just want to ask you now about a couple of bodies and standards which you should just be aware of. So if I ask you about the ILO, can anyone tell me what is the ILO? Okay, Simone.
It's the International Labour Organization.
Okay, cool. And who are they? Where do they come from?
Well, they set labour standards, obviously, and ensure that labour is organized in a way that's acceptable. Yeah. Yeah, that's basically it.
And they are they're actually a UN body, right? So they come out from the United Nations. And one of the important things which we should know about is the universal, what they call, it's the Declaration on the Fundamental Principles. Sorry, my spelling is going all over the place. So the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Okay, so if this is our UN body, what they tend to do is they deal with countries, and they talk about labor standards. They've got 4 categories in this thing, and they say freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining. Freedom of association means basically allow employees to form groups, which tends to be a union. And then the second part is their right to collective bargaining, which means that instead of individuals having to negotiate with organizations, they should be allowed to give their negotiation rights to the association. So the union, allow the union to negotiate on your behalf. And that's then much fairer, because one person against the company isn't really a fair negotiation stance. Whereas the wider workforce, the union negotiation with the company should be much fairer. Then the other things we expect to see: no forced labor, no child labor, and no discrimination. So those are the 4 key categories which come under the ILO. Now, like I said, the ILO UN body deals mostly with countries. Now, there's a group called the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is multinationals, large NGOs, etc., who come out and said, well, we need to do more. And we also need to think about how do we look at these ILOs, especially when we look across different countries, which may say, they may have different labor standards and things like that. What are the minimum requirements which we expect? And a lot of companies sign up to the ILO. And there's lots of different ones nowadays, but this is a very famous one. And the ILO has something called the base code. So if you Google or have a look at the ETI base code, it is very clear and simple, and they have 9 elements. And I'll just run you through what these are. The first one is that, and hopefully I'll remember all 9 of these, employment must be freely chosen. Okay, so that links up to what we see in the UN's Declaration of the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. It links up to this idea of no forced labor. People must be able to choose their employment and decide if they want to work or not. So no bonded labor and all those kind of things. Then we talk about freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. So just like we had in the ILO, that people must be able to form unions, and those unions should be allowed to negotiate on their behalf. Then also, when you go to work, you expect that you come home in the same situation you went. So workplace should be safe and hygienic. Yeah, so safe and hygienic working environment. Okay, and again, how would you include these kind of things in your specification? You're going to ask. You may put in requirements around protective equipment, and especially now in COVID times, you might be asking additional questions on how are they making sure that their environment is safe and hygienic, how are they operating, those kind of things, okay? So rather than just leaving it to employees, how are the organizations, in this case, we're asking our suppliers, how are they going to comply with these different elements? No child labor. Simone told us this one, okay? And that should be irrespective, most countries have legislation against it, but irrespective there, we want to make sure we have that. The next one is payment of living wages. So let me get someone to contribute here. Can anyone tell me, what is a living wage? Someone put their hand up. Can I get someone to volunteer? Or you can have a guess if you're not sure. But what do we mean by a living wage? What is that? No hands up. Okay, let me ask it a different way. So can someone tell me what we mean by minimum wages? Okay, Simone, thank you.
It's the very minimum that we are authorized to pay persons according to the kind of work that they do. Like, say, for instance, you have a minimum wage for farm workers, or you have a minimum wage for domestic workers and stuff like that. That is the very minimum that you are permitted to pay per day, per hour, etc.
And who sets that minimum wage?
Is that not the ILO?
Well, so the ILO UN doesn't have jurisdiction over what's in a country's laws. But yeah, it's government.
Oh, the government, yes.
Yeah, so government will set minimum wage, and they probably review it, every year and all these sort of things. Now, what the ETI says is, look, these minimum wages, they're not necessarily enough. Okay, and so when we say living wages, we say, well, it's one thing to have, living wage must at least be the minimum wage stipulated by law, but actually it should go further. And we say that, for someone to live their life, they must be able to, afford to have, at least, a couple of meals a day, at least one good meal a day. They must be able to, clothe themselves and their family. They must be able to provide shelter. So they must have a home, and they must be able to afford to educate their children. So their children shouldn't have to now work. So if it's a farming type business, they shouldn't have to now get their kids to come and help on the farm. They should be able to afford for them to go to school and all those other things. And that's what we mean by living wages, enough that people can actually live a life and not just survive as they might do on a minimum wage. Okay. Number 6, we say working hours are not excessive. Number 7 is no discrimination. So again, this was one of the 4 we had from the ILO. So no discrimination is practiced. And a lot of countries talk about what we call protected characteristics. So, age, gender, maternity, sexual orientation, all those kind of things are grounds, and race, religious beliefs as well. So those are what we call protected characteristics, where people shouldn't be discriminated on those grounds. Regular employment should be provided. Now, I don't know how much of an issue this is in various countries. Obviously, for the countries where we operate in, certainly in the UK, it's been a really topical issue because we have these things called 0-hour contracts. You give someone a contract which doesn't guarantee them any hours. It basically says, it's a bit like a framework agreement. It says, as and when we need you, we'll call you, in the morning and then tell you, yeah, you've got a shift today. But there may be a few weeks even which go by and you don't give people shifts. The same way we talk about payment of living wages, if you don't provide regular employment, but you have someone almost as a kind of bank worker, how are they meant to survive and plan, how they can save money and earn, etc. So it's saying if you employ people, you must provide regular employment. And the last one is no harsh or inhumane treatment. Okay, so if you start hearing of your suppliers saying, their workers are only allowed to go to the bathroom, twice a day. If there's anything around, temperature requirements, breaks, all those kind of things. Those are what we would call harsh or inhumane treatment. Okay, or if they're working under threats, those sort of things. So the base code is the private sector's kind of response, I guess, or one of many to things like the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles. Okay, so there's lots of other ones which you might be familiar with, but just be aware of the kind of things you'd expect to see in a labour standard. And then the whole point of how this might be talked about is, when we look at social standards, these are all examples of the kind of social standards which you would expect that you would be seeing or putting into your specifications. Okay, so think of it under your ethical side, and what is driving all of this? Well, there's consumer pressure. So they're saying now our own customers, so the end customers, are becoming increasingly more aware, and that's driven a lot of things. Fair trade and people buying those kind of products. We also have stakeholder pressures. So our financial investors are also saying, look, they don't want to be associated with companies who are not treating their employees in the right way. And you see money, especially investor money, moving away from companies who can't demonstrate that their supply chains are operating in these kind of responsible manners. And that puts a lot of pressure on us in procurement to not just make sure that these terms are in our contracts. So we're not just saying go beyond the legislation, make sure you have all these terms. The next stage is, you know, how do we enforce it? You know, how do we actually check and make sure that our suppliers who say, yes, we have no child labor, how do we make sure that that's not the case, especially where we have, you know, potential, you know, higher risk industries like agriculture, et cetera, at play, okay? So that's just the aspect of you know, thinking about specifications and tying that off. Now, the second part of this learning outcome, scrolling up quite a few pages now, is to just look at you know, appraising KPIs. So what do we mean by a KPI? What do we mean by an SLA, a service level agreement? And what are the kind of KPIs which we need? And if you have a look at, you know, the kind of ones I talk about, quality, performance, timeliness, cost management, resources delivery, you know, a starting point when we think about KPIs is to think back to our 5 rights of procurement and make sure that we understand it from that perspective, okay? So let's just spend a bit of time just thinking about, you know, what we mean by KPIs. So, run out of pages. Let me add a couple of blank pages. Here we are. There we are. So that's 5 or 6 there. Okay. Okay, so KPIs. So can someone tell me, you know, what is a KPI? So not a trick question to start with. So who wants to tell me what we mean by a KPI? No one want to volunteer? Emily, do you want to go ahead? Ooh. Your hand has dropped down again. So let's, Ratinzud, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
As a key performance indicator.
Okay, so you tell me it's a key performance indicator. Yes. Okay, so what makes a good KPI? Whenever you hear of the word KPI, you must think of an acronym. It begins with S.
Okay, what makes a good KPI? It's something that is measurable.
Okay, so that's one of them. So it must be measurable. What else? There's an acronym that you must always come up with straight away when you hear of KPIs.
They must be smart.
Okay, good. So can you just tell me what are the different elements of SMART? What's the S for?
It must be specific.
Okay. So specific means we've got to be clear on what we're actually measuring. And actually, you know, one of the risks is that you end up putting 100 of these KPIs in your contract, but actually you only want to be thinking about, you know, what are the key things which you care about? What are the things you're actually going to do anything about? So they must be specific, they must be measurable. What's the A?
Attainable.
Attainable or achievable. Okay, and then the R?
Relevant.
Yeah. Relevant, so what we want to look for. And then the T?
Time bound.
Time bound, okay. Now, I want to just do a quick example for you. Give me an example KPI. So anyone, give me an example KPI for, you know, let's say we're meant to have delivery of, you know, our water supplies, you know, every morning by 9 a.m. So can you someone just tell me an example of a KPI for that? They want to just say out what it might say, and let's just tick off our different elements. Ratinza, do you want to have a go at this? Who's going to volunteer? A KPI on, delivery on time, basically, is what I'm asking for. I'm going to wait for a volunteer to come up. Okay. Abubakar, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. For example, it should be delivered by 9 a.m. This is
yeah.
Down.
So give me the sentence. So you said supplier will deliver, the water.
The water at 9 a.m.
Okay, so I'll make it by 9 a.m. Okay, are we finished? What else do we need to say?
I'm finished.
So now we're saying, okay, it's specific, right? Measurable, yes, we can measure what's there by 9 a.m. We've not talked about attainable. So are we saying 100% of the time, 95% of the time, etc.?
100%.
100%. Okay, if we think that's our target, so we'd say 100% of the time, the supplier will deliver. Okay, so are we there yet? Let me add that at the top. Have we covered everything? Have we done time bound? Yes or no? Roa, do you want to come in? No? Okay.
I think it's because we mentioned it should be provided by 9 a.m.
Okay, but is that time bound? And this is why a lot of people will miss out on the time bound part. Because we've given a time, that does not mean that we have now actually bounded it. Okay, and what we mean by time bound, we have to say, if this supplier is delivering, and maybe let me change this example, and let's say we'll make it 95% of the time, okay? And let's imagine that this is a 2-year contract. So for the first 18 months, they've delivered 100% on time. Then in month 19, they deliver 95%. Month 20, they deliver 90%. Month 21, 80%. 22, 75%. Has this supplier met their KPI consistently? Yes or no? I'm just going to pop the hands down so I know who's ready to answer this question. So anyone who wants to, do we think this supplier is performing? Is anyone concerned?
I would say the supply is performing, yes. Irrespective that sometimes they do not meet 100%. However, there must be, I don't know what's the term, that consideration for certain % allowance. Okay, but in this case, let me just write this clearly. We've said that they must deliver 95% of the time. They've got to deliver this water by 9 a.m. So they did it for the first 18 months, right? Month 19, they made it, but then we start to see this trend. It's going down. So we should be concerned. Yeah? But the problem we have is our KPI was not time bound. If you average all of this, by the time we get even to month 22, the average over those months, it's still going to be close to, if not above that 95%. Now, what we need to do to make this KPI work is we would say measured on a monthly basis. So that's what we mean by time bound. We've given a period after which we reset it back to 0. So that means that every month we would say, what did you deliver this month? So we'll measure every day for that month. And then we would say, okay, this is what they've achieved. And then we start the next month fresh. If we don't make it time bound, then the supplier could turn around and say, well, yeah, even those things are going wrong now. If you average it over the last couple of years, we're still doing well.
and our intention is that we consistently want it above that level. So just make sure whenever you see a KPI, and this is what is often missing, is that time bound doesn't mean you've just given a time, you've also given a period. You say you're measuring on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, a biannual basis, annual basis, doesn't matter what you choose, it will be related to what your procurement is all about, but there must be a time period which we are looking at. Okay. So always think of SMART, make sure you understand that. And then the other thing is that, I said that, contracts move over time. So whenever we think about KPIs, we should be thinking about qualitative and quantitative factors. Sorry, my pen is not coming out properly. Quantitative. Okay. Well, what we basically are saying is that our quantitative factors are ones which are objective measures. Okay. So it's like saying if I was looking at a catering contract and I said that I want there to be 2 choices of dessert available, right? That's very clear. When you come and you have a look and there's some cake and there's some ice cream, there's 2 choices. So it's not under dispute and it's not down to anyone's particular opinion. Now, when we talk about qualitative, that is where some opinions will come into play. And this one we might say is, that it should be rated as, the food should be rated as good quality, right? What one person thinks is good quality will be different to another person's view. But the reason why we always want to make sure we have a mixture of qualitative and quantitative factors is this is what supports us with continuous improvement. Okay, so I like to use an example of catering because, imagine you've had a really bad caterer at work for a number of years and they switch it to a new caterer. And that new caterer is okay. They may not be amazing, but they're okay. When that switch happens and you ask staff to grade the quality of food, they'll be comparing it to what they had before. So you'll suddenly start seeing, if you're grading them 1 to 5, everyone's going to be giving them 5s. Then after a period of time, people will realize, hang on, well, this food isn't really getting better. And maybe it's the same menu day after day after day. And you'll start to see those ratings going down. Okay. And when you see those ratings going down, it's not necessarily that the quality has gone down of what they're offering, but rather what we're seeing is that people's expectations are that they expect to see continuous improvement. They want to see innovation, they want to see choice and all those kind of things. So that's why we use KPIs in our contract. We want to use qualitative ones as well, because it allows us to move from saying, what is good today may only be acceptable tomorrow. And in a year's time, it might be actually, poor quality. So we want to reflect that by having the ability to say, a group of people will give their subjective views about how good or bad something is. Okay? And that's why we want to make sure we have a mixture of both qualitative, so there's kind of subjective ones based on people's opinions, and then the quantitative ones where it's not subject to anyone's opinion. It's in black and white. Everyone can see what it's all about. Okay. And when we talk about SLAs are just service level agreements. They are a KPI effectively for service contracts. Responsiveness, lead times, all those kind of things come into play when we look at SLAs. Now, I mentioned the reason we like qualitative ones is because people's mindset and views change. So the last thing I just will touch on this learning outcome is when we think of KPIs, we should also think about benchmarking. So benchmarking is about saying, well, how do we compare, performance or something like that against another thing? And people will benchmark against different factors. We may compare performance. So 2 elements to this. On one hand, when we benchmark, we can say we want to benchmark against other internal factors. So if we're talking about how responsive we are as a procurement function, we might compare our responsiveness against our finance departments, our marketing departments, and other ones like that. We would also look at our competitors. Okay, so we compare our organization against our competitors. How well are we doing? You know, what's our customer service like? All those other things like that. We can also compare against other procurement functions. So if we could get data on our procurement function and compare it to what others are doing. Now, this is quite hard to do in the private sector where information isn't necessarily always available, but certainly in the public sector, you can compare between how well different procurement functions are doing in different provinces, etc., because that data should be available and published. And then the last one is what we call generic. Okay, so if you are trying to say, we want to have, customer delight and customers to be ranking us high for innovation. And we look at our competitors and we think, actually, there's no point benchmarking against our competitors because we're already industry leaders. You might say, well, what else can we compare to? So you might say, okay, well, let's compare ourselves with Apple, right? So even though you may be in completely different industries, you'd be able to say, well, how do people rank Apple brand strength? How do people rank Apple innovation compared to yours? And what is it that you can do to try and increase your ranking and your performance in those areas? Okay. And so the second part I would say is what do people actually want to compare performance against? Well, the first is defined levels. So if you've defined the performance level expected, so you've told your supplier, I want you to deliver 95% of the time, deliver, your performance should be that you meet our KPI 95% of the time, then that's a defined performance level. We can do it against the past performance. Okay, and that supports continuous improvement. You must do at least as well as or better than what you did in the past, so that as they incrementally improve performance, you're resetting that performance bar so they can't go below it in future. So that supports that kind of level of continuous improvement. Or we can do it against one of these benchmarks, which we have over here. Okay. So I think I will again open up for any questions in this particular area. The key thing is to understand when you look at KPIs, what are the important things we want to measure? Performance, what are the things which are actually in the control of the supplier, right? If it's outside of their control, why are you actually going to measure it? Because you're just going to demotivate them. They won't be motivated by something which they can't actually do, and they end up ignoring it. And the last one is the indicator. Is it an appropriate measure, and how will you measure it as well? Okay. So any questions on either just looking at the KPIs part, which we touched on quite a lot in our first learning outcome, or looking at looking at the specifications part, which we talked about in our first learning outcome, or looking at KPIs, what we mean by KPIs, what makes a good KPI, and this kind of qualitative and quantitative factors. Anyone have any questions? Okay. All right. So I think what we shall do now is just take a last 5-minute break. So it's 20 past, so just everyone have a quick stretch. And then if we can just be back at 25 past, or okay, 26 past, just so you get the full 5 minutes. And we'll look at the third and final learning outcome for this exam, and then we'll do a bit of a wrap up after that, and then any other kind of questions as well. Okay, brilliant. Okay. So okay, we're going to start looking at the final learning outcome. Just to go through the questions, I think the call-off one we have looked at already. So I can see there's a question around, what do we do when we're embedding actions or consequences, which relate from these KPI scores. I'm just going to say a brief comment on this, because this should be picked up as well in other modules and other sessions which you'll be having. It really depends on the type of contract and how strategic it is. So when we start thinking of strategic sourcing activities and things like that, where you're dealing with a strategic supplier, so think about the right-hand side of your relationship spectrum. The emphasis is around things like shared risk. So it's not about trying to use our contract to transfer the risk onto the other party. It's about saying, well, how do we share risks, make sure we've got appropriate insurances in place and all those other things. And we use KPIs as a kind of objective method of both parties just looking at performance in such a way where it shouldn't actually impact on your relationship. So you're basically saying that we both agreed that these are the kind of the level of performance which we expected, and you use it to kind of drive and remedy performance dropping. And that's why I said time bound, make sure it's clear what time period you're looking at, because you don't want to have such a long time period that by the time you now address it in your kind of supplier performance meetings, the trend has been that it's gone down quite significantly. Okay, so that's my first point on that. The second one is if you are dealing with a more tactical supplier, so a non-strategic supplier where we've got, think of your CrowdCheck matrix, you've got lots of potential other suppliers who you could switch to very easily, then your approach is going to be very different. You're going to use the KPIs and your contract actually as that benchmark for you to turn around to them and either say, look, we're going to claim damages because you're not meeting our requirements, we're going to terminate the contract and all these other things. So KPIs themselves should be there to make sure you're clear on what the performance level you need from your supplier is. The action you take for non-compliance depends on whether they're strategic, in which case you're going to work with them to try and improve that performance, or whether it's tactical, where after a couple of warnings, effectively you would be more comfortable to switch supplier. So Jan, hopefully that answers your question. Okay, good, cool. Okay, so we are now going to just look at this final learning outcome. So the first part of it, 3.1, analyze contractual terms. For those, these terms which are created with external organizations. Then we need to just understand what are some of these key terms that we'd expect to see in our contracts. And I'll just talk you through, with some of these different ones and maybe spend a little bit of time on liquidated damages and what we mean by that. Terms that apply to labor standards and ethical sourcing. Well, actually, we did a lot of this in the last one. We talked about the ILO and the Ethical Trading Initiative, the ETI. And then finally, there was a question earlier on which was talking about, what's the difference between all these different types of pricing schedules. So I'll talk to you a bit about, when we look at it from a price perspective, when we look at it from a cost perspective, and how we deal with the price adjustment clauses, formulas, etc. Okay, so that hopefully should take us through the next 20, 25 or so minutes. And then we'll probably just have 10 minutes or so at the end, just for any kind of a wrap up and final questions. Okay, so let's just start off by just looking at our types of terms. So let's go all the way down, and I will try and label up these pages for you so it's clear, when we've moved different learning outcomes, and I'll do that before this gets shared across. So we're looking at learning outcome 3, express versus implied terms. Okay, so let's make sure everyone's still awake with us, this final learning outcome. So can someone tell me what is an express term? What is an express term? What's an implied term? So let's see, we've got a couple of hands up. So is it non-fudiso? Can you tell me what do we mean by an express term and what do we mean by an implied term? Do you unmute? Okay, give me a couple of seconds. If not, Tanda, do you want to have a go?
I think the express terms is the term
so your microphone is very quiet. Do you want to try and, it might be covered?
Sorry, do you hear
it's still very faint.
Hello?
Okay, I'll have a go at listening, but it's very, very quiet. So do you want to see what you can see and see if I can hear you? Oh.
You hear me now?
Okay, go on. You go ahead and I will repeat what you say, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm going to try to raise my voice up a little.
Okay.
Express terms are the terms that it's mentioned clearly in the contract.
Oh, okay. How might it be mentioned clearly in the contract?
I mean, it's clearly written in the contract that.
Okay. So let me ask questions. Must an express term be written?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is it necessary for an express term to be written in the contract?
Express terms, yeah, it should be written in the contract. I think so.
Okay, so I'm just going to say no. So if you remember, we talked about representations earlier on. And we said that actually the things which are said, especially if it's close to the time a contract has been formed, if it influences the other party to enter into the agreement, they can still form part of the contract, even though they're not written down. So what we say when we talk about express terms is they must be clearly communicated. Okay, so they must be clearly communicated to the other party. This can be in writing or verbally. Okay, so representations form part of our express terms. Now, on the other hand, implied terms are the ones which are not necessarily communicated. However, they still form part of our contract, okay? And they form part of our contract by virtue of a number of different ways. Statute, okay? So a statute, which is just simply an act of parliament. Okay, so if we have law, which is passed in a particular area, let me just make sure my writing is clear for you. By virtue of statute, which is act of parliament. It could also be implied through what we call business efficacy. It could be implied through common law. So, you know, judicial precedent, any cases which have been held, or even by custom. So particular sectors may have certain things. So when we look at, especially when we deal with things like chieftaincy disputes with, when people give drinks and all this kind of stuff. So depending on what the culture is and stuff, there may be some custom which is now become so ingrained that we would say actually now it's actually part, it's implied in terms of our law. Just to make a quick comment, business efficacy, that basically means to make the contract possible to work. So for example, if you had a cleaning contract and your contract says your cleaners must clean the office between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. at night, even if you don't say that you're going to provide them with keys or access, it's implied, right? If they don't have access to the building, they can't clean. So that would make it an implied term, even though it may not be there. But the key ones we should be aware of is things like statute. So just to finish that off, being in procurement, every law, population's meant to be aware of every law. You can't say you are ignorant of the law, you didn't know a certain law exists, unfortunately. But there are a few ones which we need to be aware of, okay? The first is the Sale of Goods Act. Okay, and I can pretty much assure you that everyone in this meeting, irrespective of which country you're in, you would have had a Sale of Goods Act. It will depend on what year it was passed, but there'll be a Sale of Goods Act which talks about some of the things you can assume, and it's pretty universal. They talk about things like title, right? If you are buying something from someone, you can assume that they have title, right? Even if you don't ask them, you don't have to say to someone, can you confirm to me that this isn't stolen, right? You can assume that whoever is selling you something has title to sell you those goods. It also says description, right? Goods must match the description. And that's why quite often, when things are sold online, you see people writing a comment which says, the picture doesn't necessarily reflect the goods which you're going to get. Because what they're trying to say is we're trying to make it clear that the description doesn't include the photo, it's only the words we've written, and therefore your statutory rights are only limited to what we've written, okay? Satisfactory quality. Okay, so even if you buy something from the shops and they tell you no returns, no refunds, all those kind of things, the law says that goods which are sold must be of satisfactory quality. And that basically means they must be free from minor defects. Okay, if they have minor defects in there, it's not satisfactory quality. So you buy a washing machine, they tell you, oh, you've got 3 months warranty, and in month 4 it breaks down, you call the company, they say, oh, your warranty's expired. You can turn around and say, well, no, if you could show there was some kind of a defect, you'd say, look, my statutory rights, my rights by law is that I've got this implied term from the Sale of Goods Act, which is it must be of satisfactory quality. So therefore, even though you've told me 3 months warranty, my legal rights may go further. And the court will look at certain things like how much did you pay? If you paid, 1,000 Rand for it, they would say, well, you couldn't expect something which is going to last very long. But if you've gone and spent, tens of thousands on it, then they would say, well, the expectation is that it should last, a year or more, and therefore it's not satisfactory quality. Okay, and that's why you always have, those kind of statutory rights. It's also why if goods ever get delivered to you, and the courier tells you, sign this form that everything's fine. It's good practice just to write damaged, and then when you sign, then you could always argue that you haven't had the opportunity to inspect and all those kind of things. So satisfactory quality says goods must be free from minor defects. You must have the opportunity to inspect those goods, and sometimes if it's an internal defect, that inspection can only happen after you run your washing machine or whatever it is for several months. Okay. Fitness for purpose. Okay, goods you buy must be fit for the purpose of what goods of its kind are commonly sold for. The example I will use is a bucket. If you buy a bucket, it must be able to hold the liquid. If it leaks, then it's not fit for purpose. Okay. If you're using a bucket to hold open a door, then clearly, buckets weren't designed for holding open doors. If it gets damaged, you can't go back and say you want your money back. But there are, again, clauses around that. If you have told the supplier, if you tell your supplier, I'm buying a bucket to hold open doors. If they don't tell you, well, look, hang on, it's not designed for that, and they sell it to you and say, yes, fine, and then it gets damaged, because they've sold it to you, they're deemed to be, some kind of an expert. You've told them the purpose you're going to use it for. They haven't given you any kind of disclaimer or warning. Then you would say, well, you told them what the purpose was for, so therefore you have this implied right. And there's lots of cases around this. The famous case in the UK where someone was painting a pier. So a pier, which is the structure which goes out into the sea, and they told the supplier that they were using it to paint this pier. And obviously that means it's going to be around sea air, salty water, and all those kind of things. And after a very short period of time, a month or so, the paint all peeled. Supplier said, yeah, of course, this doesn't work in salty water environments. But because they'd informed the supplier the purpose which it was going to be used for, they had to pay back all the money to the buying organization because it wasn't fit for purpose. All right, the final one here is the bulk. Bulk must always match the sample. Okay, so if you get a sample and you make your order on the basis of the sample, and let's say you're buying some wallpaper, but it only shows a portion of the design. And when it arrives, you can see there's other bits of design which weren't shown in that sample. You're entitled to reject it, okay? Because the bulk isn't matching the sample you're provided with. So this is just one example of implied terms which you should be aware of. There are other ones, some countries, not all of them, for example, in Nigeria, they don't have a Supply of Goods and Services Act, but a lot of countries will say, what do we do about services? And generally speaking, services should be done within a reasonable time, to a reasonable standard, and for a reasonable price. So even if you've not agreed in advance, you're protected by those three key principles. So those are implied terms. Those are ones which are in our contract, even if we hadn't expressly communicated it. So just coming back to think a little bit more on express terms. We also need to think about the importance of our contract terms. And when we think about our contract terms and importance, we classify them into two main groups. It can either be a condition, or we could have a warranty, right? And if it's not classified, or we call it an innominate term, okay? So can I get someone just to quickly tell us, what is the difference between a condition and a warranty in contract? What's the difference between a condition and a warranty? Okay, Tando. Do you want to unmute? Having an issue unmuting. You should just click on your microphone to unmute, and hopefully we should be able to hear you. No. Okay. I think you're putting your hand up and down, but you've not unmuted your microphone yet. Okay, it's not coming. Anyone else want to tell us about what the difference we have between conditions and warranties? Okay. Okay, so let me just go ahead. Tanda, you can maybe use the chat function if you're struggling a bit with your microphone. So conditions are what go to the heart of a contract, okay? So a condition is something where we're saying it's so important that if it isn't met, then basically the contract itself has failed. And the remedy, if a condition is breached, is that you will be able to terminate, right? The injured party can terminate the contract, and they can also claim compensation, which is our damages. Yeah, so our conditions, like Tando said, is the vital terms, the ones which go to the heart of the contract, without which the contract itself is pointless. So if we used our contract for delivering of water, we might turn around and say, let's say we've got a conference. The condition is we would, and if we want time to be important, we say time is of the essence. That means that we've made time a condition. So we'd say it must be delivered by 9 a.m. on, Monday, the 5th of July, and time is of the essence. So what that means is if they now deliver it late, we are saying that that is such a large breach that we can terminate the contract, so no future obligations with that supplier, and we'll claim compensation. So if we had to go and buy water from elsewhere, it cost us more, we're going to get that extra money from them. We're going to get some compensation for the time we spend going to look for these other water suppliers and all these other things. On the other hand, a warranty is a non-vital term. It's what we call a lesser term of the contract. And the breach of warranty doesn't entitle you to terminate your contract. The contract will continue, but you can still claim damages. So if we're using our water example, we would say, maybe we said it must be delivered in, we're asking for 500 milliliter bottles of water delivered in packs of 24. And maybe the supplier has delivered them in packs of 12. Now, they've delivered it on time. So we would say, well, they've not necessarily breached a condition. It's not a serious breach, but they have still breached a term of the contract. It's a lesser term. So we're going to get compensation. The fact that maybe it's going to mean extra handling for us. We may ask and say, right, we want to be compensated for that extra work, but we couldn't terminate the entire contract. So that's one of the key things there. Now, a lot of the times you have your contracts and you won't necessarily define all your terms as conditions and warranties. Anything you have under the heading of termination. Okay, so if you've said a heading which says termination in your contract, that means that everything in that area you're considering to be a condition. If you have a heading which says warranties, then obviously you're saying there's all warranties. Everything else in the contract will be considered what we call an innominate term, which means you've not classified it as a condition or a warranty until the event of the breach occurring. So if the breach happens and it has a major impact, you're going to seek to have it classified as a condition. If it has a minor impact, then you would probably see it as a warranty. Okay, so just to be very clear, that's the key clauses you must think about when we talk about the importance of these contractual terms. Okay. Right, the next thing in the syllabus just talked about the types of contract terms and what you might have. So the standard one, if I asked you, where's your standard terms of business? I would hope that most of you are going to point me to your purchase order. Okay, so your purchase order has your your general terms and conditions under which you want to operate. And those are what we call our standard terms of business. It'll say what your normal payment terms are and all those other things associated with it. Then we might have something called model form contracts. Now, model form contracts are contracts which are done by the industry bodies. So if you go into CIPS, CIPS, for example, has model form contracts around subcontracting. They've got a few in there, in the syllabus, they talk about NEC, it's now onto NEC 4, the new engineering contract, and that's done by the Institute of Civil Engineers, and they will have standard form contracts for some of these types of construction businesses. You have FIDIC, which is done by the American Institute of Civil Engineers, and they talk about also their standard contracts and things like that. And the idea is that instead of you trying to write all these contracts from scratch, if an industry body has done it, then it is designed to be fair to both parties. So it's a standard form which is out there in the environment. So if we just talk about model forms very quickly, just be aware of some advantages and some disadvantages. So, what's the advantage of using an industry standard one? Well, it's going to make it quicker. Yeah, much quicker for you to write that contract. We talk about avoiding reinventing the wheel. You're not starting from scratch. It's generally well accepted. Another example is the Freight Transport Association. So likes of DHL and all those other things. If you move goods, in that way, and you use DHL or TNT, etc., they're members of these industry groups, and they will have adopted those model forms, which are meant to be fair to both parties. You don't have to go and negotiate every time your contract with them, and you're not also getting a contract which perhaps would be deemed to be unfair. And then, of course, it should reduce, well, we've said reduce time by the first one, but should reduce cost. Right, so you don't have to spend lots of time on lawyers and lots of money on lawyers because you have something which is, already made. Some disadvantages. Well, because if it's fair, so I just say it's accepted, so it's fair to both parties. That could be a disadvantage. Okay, because if you are a powerful buyer, you don't necessarily want your contract to be fair to both parties. right? You want to be able to use your position of power and strength, etc., to leverage and negotiate in this contract. So I'll just say it may not suit a powerful buyer. Okay, and again, because it's meant to be fair to both parties, if you start changing terms and all this kind of stuff, everyone knows that you're probably trying to be unfair. So it doesn't always put you in a good light when you are dealing with it. You may need special clauses. So if you're not well trained on these model forms, you'll think, perfect, I've got this industry standard contract, let me just apply it in this particular situation, but actually you may not have covered all your risks. So it may not necessarily be the best. And in such situations, you then still may need legal advice, which obviously comes with some kind of a cost. And then you also have to make sure you train the procurement team, so train the buyers. And again, that comes with some kind of a cost associated with it. Okay, so model form contracts are, your standard contracts or your standard terms of business. If you see questions around that, they're talking about your own organization's standard terms of business, which are normally on your purchase order. If you hear about model form contracts, those are ones which are done by industry bodies. So institutes of engineers, freight transport associations, freight forwarding associations, and then like CIPS has their ones, like I said, on subcontracting and all those kind of things. Okay, so those will be the ones you need to be aware of. And then of course, the other one would just be a bespoke contract. And that's where you start from scratch and you draft a contract from scratch between both parties. It should cover all your requirements, but obviously it's going to take time, and it's also going to take quite a lot of costs. Okay. So just as we kind of, I'm mindful that some of you may have to drop off in 5 minutes, so I will just try and top and tail these last elements. The key terms in a contract we should be aware of. So the first one, it says indemnities and liabilities. So a liability is effectively where someone has to take responsibility or takes the risk of when things go wrong. So if I am a supplier, I might be asked by my customer to indemnify them from losses. So think of the example of when they have those Samsung phones and the batteries are overheating and the phones are exploding, etc. What would happen in that kind of a situation is you've got Samsung here, you've got the end customer there, and you've got their battery supplier here. Samsung would have had an indemnity clause, and this is what you should always have in your contracts with your suppliers. You want to have a clause which basically says, if because of an issue or a defect with their product, there is some damage caused to any kind of third party, they indemnify you, as their buying organization from any losses. So if, the phone caught fire because of the battery and it damaged someone's living room, and they're now suing Samsung to say, right, we want you to pay for that cost. Samsung would be able to say to this supplier, well, actually, it's your fault because it's your battery which did that. So you indemnify us, which means that you take all our liability away and you would compensate the end customer. So Samsung would compensate them and get the money back from this supplier. And that's through an indemnity clause. Now, normally when you have an indemnity clause, you want to make sure that that supplier, your supplier, has enough money, because Samsung huge, they may have had a huge number of complaints and claims. You want to make sure that that supplier has enough money. So alongside an indemnity clause, you normally would want to see an insurance. So you should be aware of the different types of insurance, right? So we have product liability insurance, which basically says if the product causes damage, the insurance company is going to cover that. Professional indemnity insurance, which says if you're given advice, if it's a service, then you give poor advice, then the insurance company is going to cover that. You would always expect to see two other clauses in place. One is what we call employer's liability. Okay, so think of workman's compensation and things like that. So you're saying if employees get injured in the course of their work, do you have appropriate insurance? Does your supplier have appropriate insurance to cover that cost? And the other one you might want is public liability. So if you have a contractor doing work on your site or wherever, where members of the public or your staff may also be going through, you want to make sure that if they create a situation which results in someone getting injured, that their insurance will cover that. And that's different to employers' liability, which only covers employees. Public liability is the one which covers members of the public who may be impacted. We've got a subcontracting clause, which basically says, like I said at the beginning, you want a clause which basically says, if there is a problem, if you want to subcontract, you cannot do it without our prior consent. So I just saw a comment about sound. Hopefully, I suspect it might be your connection, but if anyone else is having an issue with my sound, do drop me a note and I will have a look at it. But subcontracting clause basically says you can't subcontract unless we allow you to, and even if we do, you must make sure that your people are bound by the same terms. Your subcontractor is bound by the same terms which we are bound by. And liquidated damages clause. I'm just going to very quickly give a note on that and what we mean by a liquidated damages clause. So liquidated damages clause. So damages are all about compensation. And there's two ways that you may get that compensation: through what we call unliquidated damages, which means you get your money based on your actual losses incurred. And then you could have liquidated damages. And I'll just give you an idea to drop notes on this. Liquidated damages, what they have done is that there are a genuine pre-estimate, and that's the key phrase we have to say, a genuine pre-estimate of the loss which you would expect to be incurred in the event of the other party breaching the contract. So if a supplier fails to deliver on time, what do you expect your losses to be? If it's, you've ordered a car, your car's not delivered on time, it might be, rental costs that you have to rent another car for. And there may be some time associated with organizing that rental and all those other things. So you can only get your genuine pre-estimates. They normally expressed in monetary terms. Be very careful if you have liquidated damages clauses in percentages, because you have to still demonstrate, how did you come up with that estimate? And when you lose money, you lose actual money. You don't lose a percentage of income, you lose money. So generally speaking, unless you can link that percentage to an actual loss, it's normally expressed in monetary terms. Now, if it's not a genuine pre-estimate, it's what we call a penalty clause. And penalty clauses are not enforceable. Okay, because we are dealing with what we call civil law, and civil law is about restitution, compensation, and not punishment. So someone breaching a contract doesn't end up in prison. Okay, you can only end up in prison on criminal activities. So if, for example, a court had ordered someone to refund money and they didn't, then when you don't follow a court order, then you're in contempt of court, and that is criminal. But generally speaking, our contracts are all civil, which means that you can't end up in prison, but it also means you can't penalize them. You can't gain as a result of the other party breaching a contract. You can only claim your compensation. But if it is found to be a penalty clause, again, because civil law is all about fairness, they will cancel that clause and then they'll go to unliquidated and say, prove to us the actual amount of money which you have lost. Okay, so that's liquidated damages. Just the last minute or so, and then I'll let everyone disappear and go. The final learning outcome just talks about pricing arrangements in contracts. And what you should be aware of is that this is all about where does risk go. From your perspective, if you have a fixed price contract, that's pretty much perfect, because you can plan on that basis. So you may start off by saying you want to have a fixed price contract, which means you know exactly how much you are paying. But there are factors which come into place, especially if you have, like I said, strategic suppliers. You want to try and share the risk. So you might actually have some kind of price adjustment formulas. And it might be, if it's a logistics contract, you would link it and say, if the price of fuel moves by more than 5%, then you're going to give them an increase, which is 20% of the movement. So if it moves by 5%, 20% of that is 1%, because you know that fuel is a big cost, but obviously there's other costs like the maintenance and the drivers and all those other things there. So you have price adjustment clauses which link onto prices. The other way to look stuff is from a cost perspective. Now this tends to be where you're doing things like open book, or there's elements in there which are outside of the control of the two parties. So think of vaccine procurement, right? At the beginning, you don't know how much time or how long it will take to come up with a vaccine. So if you were a government and you were contracting on that basis that you wanted to pay for someone to research it, you couldn't necessarily use a fixed price contract or even a price adjustment. You would use a contract based on cost. And when you do contracts based on the cost, it can just be on a cost reimbursable basis, which basically means you're only going to pay them what it costs them and no more. That tends to be, public sector or NGOs type things like that. But more often than not, if you want private sector to do something, they must make some money. So you would say that you're going to give them all their costs associated with it, plus a fixed price. Or you could say you give them their costs plus a fixed percentage. Now, again, those ones don't guarantee you any solution. You could just be paying them forever on a cost plus fixed price. So the last one we also talk about is an incentive. So we would say, okay, we're giving you all your costs, plus we're going to give you an incentive. So you basically say, we're going to refund you, research facility, for all the money you spend on trying to find a vaccine. If you find a vaccine, we're going to give you an incentive of a one-off success fee payment of 1 million, but that's only if you're successful. If not, you're just getting your costs back. And that way you're kind of sharing the risk equally, because you're saying to them, if we don't get any benefit from it, you're only getting your costs and no profitability. But if we do get it, we're going to make sure that you get a nice bonus at the end of it all. Okay. So I think I will leave it there in terms of we've covered a good chunk of that, pretty much all the syllabus, and hopefully these notes will be useful. We touched on payment terms a little bit earlier on, that suppliers obviously want to get paid up front. Buyers, you want to pay as late as you can, and ideally after you've received the goods and had the opportunity to do your inspection. So I'll just say, anyone have any questions? Maybe we have a minute or so for if anyone's got any question. Please do pop it in the chat now or the Q&A, and I'll try and answer that. I can see there's a question about the recording, and I will pass that on to the CIPS team, but I do know it's been recorded. I think they said at the beginning that it will be made available for a period of time. So anyone else have any questions? Okay. Tando, you asked a question, what is meant by predeterminable? Can you just give me the context of that, please? So are we talking about with respect to pricing? So I'm going to take a guess at the concept when you say with respect to pricing. So when we're talking about a predetermined one, that's normally linked to some kind of a formula when we talk about price adjustments or pricing. So if, for example, you want to do a fixed price contract, but you're saying that actually you want the pricing not to be based on a number which you provide in a contract, but you provide them a formula for saying, well, each time a payment is due, this is how you're going to calculate it. You're going to have some kind of formula which links, indexation linked to maybe inflation, and you compare inflation with your starting price, and you just multiply those two together. So if inflation is at 5% and your starting price was 10,000 Rand, then the next time we're going to pay 10,500. So that's what we would talk about if we talk about determining price and predetermined ones. It's normally based on a pre-agreed formula before you know, at the outset of the contract. Okay. Okay. Any other ones? In terms of there's a question about other modules, and again, I think I'll leave that one to the CIPS team to answer. I know there are these going on for all the level 4 modules on different days, so I believe there should be a way for you to register for that to the appropriate channel. Okay. Okay. So I think I cannot see any other questions. I don't know if anyone from the CIPS team is available just to close out and answer maybe on the questions on the other modules. Okay. But I will pass the question on just about the other modules. It should have been listed somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't have the information of who is running those other sessions and when those are on. But what I would say is, for those of you who've joined today, thank you very much for your engagement. Hopefully you've got enough out from this, and it's going to be useful for you in attempting your exams. And like Sari said, I'm also hoping we'll engage with some of you from our study centre perspective, and I'm sure the CIPS team will share our details of us at Harley Reed. But thank you very much, and good luck in your exams.